Today we're going to be discussing the results of the murder of Anna Kane, which happened in October of 1988. So,
She was 26 years old, a firecracker, outgoing, not afraid of anything. Honest, blunt, and caring, those are the exact words her daughter used. The kind of person who took up space in a room without apologizing for it. The kind of mother whose children, 34 years after she was taken from them, still describe her with that particular warmth that only comes from having been genuinely loved by someone. She had 3 children, a girl and 2 boys. The girl was 9 years old when her mother was murdered. On the early morning of October 23rd, 1988, Anna Jean Kane was last seen alive at the corner of Franklin Street and South 6th Street in Reading, Pennsylvania. It was approximately 1 in the morning. She was 26 years old. Her body was found later that same morning along Ontolani Trail Road in Perry Township, Berks County. Beaten, strangled with baling twine, dumped in the woods like something disposable. The man who killed her was 26 years old, the same age as Anna, living in the same corner of Berks County. He left his DNA on her clothing, and then he did something that belongs in a category of its own. 2 years after he murdered her, after a local newspaper ran a front-page story about the case asking for information, he sat down, wrote a letter, sealed the envelope with his tongue, signed it a concerned citizen, and mailed it to the Reading Eagle. The letter contained intimate details about the murder that only the killer could have known. He was not confessing. He was not turning himself in. He was watching. He was making sure the case stayed interesting to him. He was the kind of man who enjoys his own secret so much that he cannot resist brushing up against it. Carefully, anonymously, just enough to feel it. He did not know what his saliva would one day say. 32 years later, the DNA on that envelope seal and the DNA on Anna Kane's clothing said the same name, Scott Grimm. He had been dead for 4 years by the time investigators spoke his name in a Pennsylvania press conference. He died in 2018 of natural causes at the age of 58. He went to his grave thinking he'd won. He hadn't. He had mailed his own conviction to a newspaper in 1990. He just didn't know it yet. This is Anna's story. Reading, Pennsylvania in 1988 was a Rust Belt city working through the slow grief of deindustrialization. The kind of city where working class families held on with both hands while the economic structures that had supported them for generations quietly dissolved. The streets around Franklin and South 6th had the particular texture of neighborhoods where people get by however they can, where the systems meant to catch people often arrive too late or not at all. Anna Jean Kane was 26 years old and a mother of 3, 1 daughter, Tamika, and 2 sons. The younger boys too small to hold on to memories of her after she was gone. She had been living in Hamburg, Berks County, but had moved several times in the months before her death. She was unemployed at the time she was killed. She was, as police would later confirm, working as a prostitute in the Reading area. The news coverage from 1988 focused almost entirely on her occupation. The front-page story about her murder in the Reading Eagle, the very story that would indirectly lead to the killer being identified, described her circumstances in the clinical, distancing language that newspapers of that era used for women like Anna, a way of categorizing her before humanizing her, a way of signaling to readers that this was a certain kind of victim. Her daughter, Tamika Reyes, speaking to cameras 34 years later as a grown woman, pushed back against all of that without raising her voice. She said, "She was a person. She was my mother. We loved her and still do." She never got the opportunity to make a change. We will always wonder why did it have to be this way? And she described her mother in the terms that no news article had bothered with. A firecracker, very outgoing, not afraid of anything, very honest, blunt, and caring. That is who Anna Jean Kane was. That is who was standing at the corner of Franklin and South 6th at 1 in the morning on October 23rd, 1988. Before someone offered her a ride, or she accepted one, or whatever combination of desperation and danger produced the last hour of her life. She was a firecracker. She deserved decades she never got. Her body was found on the morning of October 23rd, 1988, along Ontolani Trail Road in Perry Township, a wooded stretch of road in rural Berks County, far from the city streets where she had last been seen alive. She had been dead for approximately 12 hours when she was discovered. She was fully clothed. She had not been sexually assaulted, but she had been in a violent physical struggle. Bruising on her body confirmed it. She had fought back, and her killer had ended that struggle with a length of baling twine. Rough agricultural rope tied around her neck The Berks County coroner confirmed the cause of death the following day: asphyxiation due to strangulation. Forensic pathologist Dr. Neil A. Hoffman had performed the autopsy. The baling twine was cataloged and preserved. Her clothing was collected and preserved. And on multiple items of that clothing, her killer had left his DNA. In 1988, that DNA could tell investigators one thing and one thing only. The contributor was male. No database, no profile matching, no genealogy. Just the biological confirmations that a man had been in physical contact with Anna Kane in the last moments of her life. Pennsylvania State Police opened the investigation. Leads were pursued. Berks County was canvassed. Nothing broke. The DNA sat on Anna's clothing in evidence storage, waiting. And then, 2 years later, the killer decided to make contact. In 1990, the Reading Eagle ran a front-page story about Anna Kane's unsolved murder. It was the kind of story that cold case families hope for, and investigators pray will generate tips, a public reminder that someone had been killed and the case was still open, and anyone with information should come forward. The story included details about the investigation, the circumstances of the murder, and the ongoing effort to identify a suspect. Within days of that story running, the Reading Eagle received a letter. It was signed, "A Concerned Citizen." It contained intimate details about the homicide. Details that had not been published. Details that had not been released to the public. Details that, as Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Daniel Wilmer said at the 2022 press conference, led investigators to one immediate conclusion. This led investigators to believe that whoever wrote the letter had committed the homicide. The letter was not a confession. It was not a plea for forgiveness. It read as the kind of communication a certain type of killer writes when the crime has started to feel like his secret alone, when the thrill of knowing something everyone else is trying to find out becomes almost unbearable. And the only way to manage it is to brush up against the investigation, to poke at it, to remind himself that he is still ahead. He was careful. He did not sign his name. He did not include return address information. He constructed the letter to give away the knowledge without giving away the identity. What he did not construct for, what he almost certainly never thought about, was saliva. He licked the envelope to seal it. Pennsylvania State Police extracted DNA from that seal. The profile matched the DNA found on Anna Kane's clothing. The same man. Confirmed. The person who had killed Anna Jean Kane had mailed a letter to a newspaper 2 years later, had sealed it with his own saliva, had delivered, unknowingly, a second piece of biological evidence that corroborated the first, and which, 32 years later, would survive long enough for a genetic genealogy to read it and speak his name. The letter was preserved, logged, stored, exactly as the clothing had been. 2 pieces of evidence sitting in different facilities, holding the same secret, waiting for the science to arrive. For decades, Anna's case sat exactly where it had landed after the letter was identified as the killer's. A DNA profile confirmed to match both the clothing and the envelope seal. No hit in any database. No criminal record requiring a DNA sample. No name to attach to the profile. The evidence existed. The science to extend it did not. In 2022, 34 years after the murder, Pennsylvania State Police submitted the DNA profile to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia for genetic genealogy analysis. Parabon is the same laboratory that had helped solve dozens of cold cases across the country using the technique pioneered in the Golden State Killer investigation of 2018. Building family trees from DNA uploaded to public ancestry databases, identifying distant relatives of the unknown contributor, narrowing the field generation by generation until a name emerged. The results pointed to a man from the Hamburg, Pennsylvania area, the same part of Berks County where Anna had been living in the months before her death. His name was Scott Grimm. Investigators immediately ran his name through available records. He had one prior arrest in 2002 in Exeter Township, Berks County, for harassing a former business partner. The nature of that harassment was distinctive. Grimm had mailed threatening letters to the man, multiple letters, sent through the postal system, sealed with his own hand, the same method, the same behavior. A man who communicated his hostility and his power through the mail, who made himself felt through envelopes and stamps, and the particular confidence of the person who believes anonymity protects him. Investigators obtained DNA from those 2002 harassment envelopes. They compared it against the 1990 letter to the Reading Eagle. They compared it against the clothing from 1988. Everything matched. 3 separate DNA confirmations. The clothing from the night of the murder, the newspaper letter from 2 years later, the harassment envelopes from 2002. 3 separate moments across 14 years, in which Scott Grimm had deposited his biological identity somewhere that investigators could eventually find it, never knowing, apparently, that the act of sealing an envelope was the act of signing his name. Scott Grimm was a native of the Hamburg area. He was 26 years old at the time of the murder, the same age as Anna Kane. He had moved to the Birdsboro area, about 10 miles from Reading, shortly before the killing. Investigators could not establish exactly how he had encountered Anna or what the nature of their interaction had been on the night of October 23rd, 1988. What they could establish, beyond any scientific doubt, was that he had killed her. He had also been dead for 4 years. Scott Grimm died of natural causes in 2018 at the age of 58. He never faced a police officer in connection with Anna Kane's murder. He never sat in a courtroom. He never heard his name read in a verdict. Investigators declined to explain publicly how they obtained a direct DNA sample from Grimm to confirm the genealogy results, only that it was obtained legally through a search warrant. The most likely method, biological material preserved from his own death, the same approach that had been used in other cases. His own remains turned against his own secret. On August 18, 2022, Pennsylvania State Police and Berks County District Attorney John Adams stood at a press conference at Troop L headquarters in Reading and announced what the evidence had proven. Scott Grimm had beaten and strangled Anna Jean Kane on October 23, 1980, and then he had mailed a letter about it to the newspaper. Tamika Reyes was 9 years old when her mother was murdered. She was old enough to know Anna, old enough to carry real memories, real impressions, the specific texture of what it feels like to be loved by a particular person in a particular way. Old enough that the loss was not an abstraction. It was a presence that became an absence overnight and never came back. Her 2 brothers were younger. They do not remember their mother. They grew up with the story of her instead of the memory, which is its own kind of grief. Inheriting a wound from a person you can no longer picture. Tamika Reyes stood before the cameras on August 18, 2022 and said, "I didn't think I'd see this day, but I had hope. My emotions are all over the place. Happy, sad, angry. Happy, sad, angry. Not one clean emotion. Not the neat resolution that people who have never waited 34 years for an answer imagine justice feels like. All 3 things at once, because that is what it actually is." She said she was happy to finally put a face behind the monster who took her mother from them. She said she was upset that he would never face consequences. She said her grandmother, Anna's mother, had died before hearing the answer. That the person who had raised Anna, who had outlived her daughter and waited 34 years and never stopped wanting to know, was gone before the press conference, before the name, before the explanation. That detail does not have a word for it. It simply is what it is. Another casualty of 34 years. Tamika had only one more thing she needed the world to know about Anna Jean Kane before the cameras moved on. She was a person. She was my mother. We loved her. Still do. Scott Grimm mailed his own conviction to a newspaper in 1990. He sat down. He wrote a letter containing information that only the killer could know. Information that immediately told investigators the author was their suspect. He folded it. He put it in an envelope. He pressed his tongue to the seal and ran it along the glue. He affixed a stamp. He dropped it in a mailbox. He was 28 years old. He had been living with his secret for 2 years, and the arrogance, or the compulsion, or whatever combination of psychology produces this behavior, drove him to reach out and touch the investigation from a distance, to be in it without being seen, to be the concerned citizen and the perpetrator simultaneously. He thought the anonymity was absolute. He had not thought about DNA. In 1990, nobody was licking envelopes and worrying about the forensic implications. DNA evidence was only just beginning to be used in criminal courts. The idea that saliva on a postage stamp could one day be run through a genealogy database and produce a name from a family tree, that concept did not exist in any meaningful public understanding. Grimm sealed that envelope with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He was not untouchable. He was just ahead of the science. And the science caught up. There is the detail about the 2002 harassment case. Grimm had sent threatening letters to a former business partner. The same method, the same behavior, the same compulsion to use the postal system as a vehicle for control and intimidation. He was arrested. It was a harassment charge, not a violent crime. It did not generate a DNA sample entry into CODIS. It did not flag him in any system as a potential suspect in a 1988 murder. But those letters survived. And when investigators ran the genealogy comparison and Grimm's name emerged, those 2002 envelopes were sitting in Exeter Township police files available for comparison. 3 separate samples across 14 years, all confirming the same profile. He could not stop himself from sealing envelopes, and every one of those sealed envelopes was a piece of evidence against him. And then there is Captain Robert Bailey's statement at the press conference. One that deserves to be said again, slowly, because it is the most important thing anyone said that day. Every victim, despite their background, deserves closure. Despite their background. He said it because he knew it needed saying. Because Anna Kane's background, her occupation, her circumstances, her neighborhood, had defined the coverage of her murder in 1988 in ways that her daughter was still pushing back against 34 years later. Because the systems that are supposed to protect people do not always protect them equally. Because some victims get front page headlines about their personalities, and some get front page headlines about their professions. Anna Kane was a firecracker. She was outgoing and not afraid of anything, and honest and blunt and caring. She was a mother of 3. She was 26 years old. She deserved closure just as much as anyone. And it took 34 years and a postage stamp to give it to her. Anna Jean Kane was 26 years old. She was a firecracker, very outgoing, not afraid of anything, honest and blunt and caring all at once. She had 3 children who needed her, a daughter old enough to remember, 2 sons who would grow up with a story instead of a memory. She deserved to watch Tamika grow up, to be there when her daughter stood in front of cameras one day and described her mother to the world, to hear herself called those words, outgoing, not afraid of anything, honest, blunt, and caring, and recognize herself in them. Instead, she is frozen at 26. Frozen on a dark October morning in 1988. Frozen in the memory of a 9-year-old girl who grew into a woman who never stopped having hope, even when she stopped expecting the answer. But the letter was not frozen. The letter Scott Grimm sealed and signed a concerned citizen, and dropped in a mailbox in 1990. That letter sat in the files of the Reading Eagle, then in the files of Pennsylvania State Police for 32 years, untouched, preserved. The DNA on its seal unchanged. Unaware of time, holding its secret in a way that its author never imagined possible. He thought the envelope was empty of consequence. It was full of his name. And in 2022, Parabon Nanolabs read it. Pennsylvania State Police confirmed it against 3 separate samples across 14 years. And take Reyes, who was 9 years old when her mother was murdered, and who had spent 34 years hoping, without expectation, finally had a face to put behind the monster. Scott Grimm is dead. He died in 2018. He will never sit in a courtroom. He will never hear a verdict. He will never look Anna's children in the eye and be called what he was. But his name is on the record now, permanently, attached to what he did, and the envelope he sealed in 1990, the one he sent to make himself feel powerful and untouchable, is the reason. He undid himself with a postage stamp, and Anna Kane's grandmother did not live to hear the answer. That is the wound that no announcement can close. The person who raised Anna, who outlived her daughter and spent 34 years waiting, gone before August 18th, 2022. That is what 34 years costs. That is what every year of silence costs. Not just the victim, not just the children. Everyone who loved her and waited. Some of them wait long enough. Some of them don't. Tamika Reyes waited. And she has an answer now. And she said the only thing that needed to be said, in the plainest words possible. She was a person. She was my mother. We loved her and still do. If you believe that a 26-year-old mother, described as a firecracker, deserves more than 34 years of silence, that a daughter who spent her entire life hoping without expecting deserves to be heard, that a killer who licked an envelope in 1990 and thought he was untouchable deserves to have his name spoken on the record, then right now, before you scroll past this, hit subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell us what part of Anna's story stopped you cold. Because Captain Bailey said something at that press conference that needs to echo beyond one press room in Reading, Pennsylvania. He said, every victim, despite their background, deserves closure. Every victim. Not just the ones with clean narratives. Not just the ones whose circumstances the world finds easy to sympathize with. Not just the ones whose murders make front pages without a qualifier attached. Every single one. Anna Kane was a firecracker, a mother, a person. She mattered then. She matters now. Every time you subscribe, every time you share one of these stories, you are saying that out loud, that these names matter, that these families deserve to be heard, that the women this world has tried to categorize before humanizing are seen by someone. They are seen here. Anna Jean Kane, 26 years old, honest, blunt, caring, and not afraid of anything. She had a daughter who never gave up hope, and a killer who sealed his own fate with his own tongue and didn't know it for 32 years. 34 years, 9 months, 25 days. The clock has stopped,